The county fair came every August, rolling into the small town like a tradition no one questioned. Families lined the gravel parking lot, children pulling on their parents' arms to hurry toward the smell of fried dough and the echo of calliope music. It was the sort of event where generations could point to a ride or a booth and say they remembered it looking the same when they were children. On that particular Saturday, the sun was high, the air sticky with heat, and thousands of people filled the grounds. It was noisy, alive, and for one family, it was supposed to be a simple day of fun. They brought their 8-year-old daughter, a girl known for her curiosity and boundless energy, to ride the carousel, eat cotton candy, and see the animals in the livestock barns. Her parents had no way of knowing this day would become the one they would spend the rest of their lives replaying in their minds. For much of the morning, everything was ordinary. They wandered the midway together, stopping at game booths, taking pictures by the Ferris wheel, letting their daughter try her first taste of funnel cake. Around midday, they made their way toward the barns, drawn by the bleating goats and the prize-winning cattle being brushed down by proud young handlers. It was here, in a place they considered safe and familiar, that everything changed. They remembered her skipping a few feet ahead, peering into stalls and pointing at the animals with excitement. She had always been drawn to animals, especially horses, and the barns were her favorite part of the fair. There were hundreds of people moving in and out of the building, voices carrying, doors opening and closing. It was busy, but nothing unusual. Then, in what seemed like the blink of an eye, she was gone. At first, her parents thought she had simply wandered into the next aisle. They called her name, certain she would come running back, smiling, maybe with a story about a calf or a rabbit she had found. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. They began searching the barn, weaving between pens and hay bales, asking other parents if they had seen a little girl in a yellow summer dress. No one had. The father jogged outside to scan the crowds, thinking maybe she had stepped out into the sunshine. The mother retraced steps through the livestock area, her voice rising with each unanswered call. Within 10 minutes, unease began to creep in. By the 15-minute mark, panic had set in. They alerted fair staff who made announcements over the loudspeakers, asking anyone who saw a girl matching her description to bring her to the main office. Security volunteers started walking the grounds, checking rides, food lines, and restrooms. For a while, there was hope she might turn up near the midway, distracted by flashing lights or music. Parents around the grounds joined the search, scanning faces in the crowd. By the 30-minute mark, with no sign of her, the fear that had been quietly building turned into something sharper. The family contacted the sheriff's office, and uniformed deputies were soon on site. The search was no longer casual. It was urgent. Investigators initially worked off the most common scenario. Children at fairs often wander. They thought perhaps she had followed a group of older kids, gotten lost in the crowd, or even grown tired and sat down somewhere hidden. Deputies began a systematic sweep of the grounds. Carnival workers were questioned, restrooms checked, and loudspeaker announcements repeated. The family was ushered to a central location so deputies could gather details: her height, hair color, clothing, any identifying features. The mother clutched her daughter's sandals, which had slipped off earlier at the playground, repeating over and over how quickly she had disappeared. Every detail was logged, every lead followed. Still, there was no trace. By the second hour, the scope of the search widened. Deputies expanded beyond the fairgrounds, checking the parking areas and bordering cornfields. Search dogs were brought in. Handlers hoping to pick up her scent from a hairbrush rushed over from the family's car. Crowds were urged to step back, organizers pleading for order as panic started spreading among parents. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through rows of tall corn, calling her name into the hot afternoon air. All they found were broken stalks from fairgoers cutting through as shortcuts. The girl's trail seemed to end at the edge of the livestock barns, fading as though she had stepped into thin air. It was around this time that suspicion began shifting. Deputies realized that an 8-year-old alone would almost certainly have been noticed wandering through the crowded midway. The lack of sightings made it less likely she had simply gotten lost. When bloodhounds were given her scent, They followed it past the barns and toward the edge of the grounds, only to lose it abruptly at a gravel road leading away from the fair. This suggested something deputies did not want to admit too quickly. She may have been taken into a vehicle. The atmosphere at the fairgrounds shifted from anxious to terrified. Nightfall approached and floodlights were set up across the grounds. Cars leaving the lot were stopped and searched. Helicopters circled with spotlights, and investigators went door to door at nearby farmhouses. Families gathered close, parents refusing to let their children out of sight. The fair, meant to be a place of laughter and tradition, was suddenly gripped by fear. Hours had passed, and the only thing deputies had to show were the small shoes the mother still carried, and the knowledge that whatever had happened to the little girl, it had happened fast. The sheriff made the call before midnight to escalate the case. What began as a missing child report was now treated as a possible abduction. State investigators were notified, and the FBI prepared to step in. For the family, the night dragged endlessly, every sound of laughter or music from the rides outside feeling cruel and misplaced. The county fair, once their happiest outing of the summer, had become the last place they had seen their daughter. And by sunrise, hope that she had merely wandered off was nearly gone, replaced with the dreadful question of who had taken her and how they had slipped away unseen. When the sheriff declared the situation an abduction rather than a lost child, the tone of the fairgrounds shifted instantly. Music still blared from carnival rides, but it no longer carried joy. It clashed against the sight of deputies stringing up floodlights, volunteers forming search lines, and parents gripping their children's hands as if afraid to ever let go. The night air grew heavy with tension, every corner of the fairground suddenly suspect. The girl's name echoed again and again from strangers' lips, called into darkness with no reply. Deputies began with the obvious places. Parking lots were swept with flashlights, every car inspected as families tried to leave. Open trunks, glove compartments, and back seats were checked by uniformed officers under the glare of portable lights. Nothing stood out. At the same time, teams spread outward into the surrounding farmland. Rows of tall corn stretched for miles, the perfect hiding place for a frightened child, or for something far worse. Volunteers linked arms and pushed through, stalks brushing against their shoulders, their voices rising above the chorus of insects. They searched ditches, irrigation canals, even abandoned farm machinery. All they found were trampled plants and silence. Search dogs arrived from a neighboring county just before midnight. Handlers were handed the girl's hairbrush, rushed from the family's home, and soon the hounds were straining against their leashes. They pulled investigators in one direction, away from the midway, past the barns, and toward the gravel road that bordered the fairgrounds. For a moment, there was hope. Maybe she had simply wandered further than anyone thought. Maybe she was still close by. But then, just as suddenly, the trail evaporated. The dogs whined, circling without purpose, their noses lifting as if the scent had been cut off completely. To trained handlers, the meaning was clear. It suggested she hadn't just walked out of the fair, she had been carried or taken into a vehicle. This possibility sank through the gathered crowd like a cold wave. Parents who had been willing to believe she was hiding somewhere nearby realized now that someone may have driven off with her under their noses. Deputies set up roadblocks miles in each direction, but by then, hours had passed since she was last seen. Rural roads branched endlessly across farmland, leading into towns, highways, and wooded backcountry. If she'd been taken by car, the radius of possibility stretched endlessly. The first physical clue came when deputies swept the barns once more. Near the entrance of the livestock building where she had last been seen, a deputy noticed a pair of small shoes resting neatly against the wooden wall. At first, they thought the mother had left them behind in her grief, but she was still clutching the earlier pair her daughter had slipped off that morning. These shoes were different, belonging to the missing child, recognizable by the scuffed toes and faded butterfly stitching along the sides. Their placement struck investigators as odd. They weren't discarded haphazardly the way a child might kick them off. They were positioned side by side, as if someone had set them there deliberately. The discovery raised unsettling questions. Had the girl been forced to remove them, or had someone placed them there to mislead the search? Deputies collected them carefully, bagging them as evidence, but the sight of those tiny shoes shook even seasoned officers. For the parents, it was unbearable. They were handed nothing but a confirmation of what they already feared, that their daughter had not simply wandered away. Something had been done to her. As dawn approached, the fairground was transformed into the center of a full-scale investigation. Dozens of volunteers slumped against fences, exhausted from searching the fields. Deputies coordinated interviews, pulling aside carnival workers, food vendors, and livestock exhibitors. Every stranger was suddenly a potential suspect. Did anyone see a man leading a child? Did anyone notice a vehicle leaving in haste? The responses were vague. Some remembered a pickup idling near the barns. Others thought they saw a girl with an older teenager. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. Meanwhile, the county itself grew restless. News traveled fast, parents waking to the shocking word that a child had been taken during the fair. Rumors sprouted overnight. Some swore they had seen suspicious men near the rides. Others whispered about outsiders, the seasonal workers who followed the carnival circuit. The sheriff tried to calm the speculation, but the damage was done. Suspicion spread through neighbors like a stain, everyone looking over their shoulder at people they had once trusted. The parents were led home in the early hours, though neither could sleep. Deputies asked them to retrace every step of their day, replay every detail of their daughter's movements in case something had been missed. But the memory always ended the same. She was there 1 second, smiling, laughing, and gone the next. By the time the sun rose, the fairground looked like a crime scene rather than a festival. Police tape crisscrossed entrances, rides sat idle, and the livestock barn was cordoned off with officers posted at each corner. Helicopters still circled overhead. The child's name no longer echoed from hopeful voices, but from stern announcements to the press. What began as a summer outing was now a nightmare, frozen in time. The most chilling thought began to settle into everyone's mind, that if the dogs were right and the shoes had been placed intentionally, the abductor might have been among them, watching the search unfold, moving through the crowd unnoticed. And if that was true, then the girl's disappearance was not random chaos, but something carefully planned, executed under the noise and chaos of the fair. And though the community didn't yet realize it, this was only the first of many nights they would spend haunted by the question of what really happened inside those barns. In the days that followed, detectives worked without rest, grasping at any lead that surfaced. The fairgrounds, once filled with laughter, became a stage for interrogations and suspicion. Every face captured in photographs or remembered by witnesses was run through background checks. Anyone who had been near the barns that day was asked to account for their movements, and when stories didn't add up, suspicions sharpened. 3 names rose quickly to the top of the list, each one carrying the potential of an answer, and yet none would ever bring the closure the family so desperately needed. The first was a carnival worker, whose presence had unsettled parents even before the disappearance. He had been assigned to the ring toss booth, but multiple witnesses claimed he drifted near the barns that afternoon. A check into his background revealed prior arrests, nothing directly linked to children, but enough to raise concern. Disorderly conduct, petty theft, and one disturbing incident of following a teenager home from a bus stop years earlier. Detectives leaned on him hard, pulling him into a small interview room and pushing for answers. He denied any involvement, insisting he never left his booth except to smoke. His timeline was shaky, dependent on the word of fellow carnival workers who themselves seemed evasive. Yet when his trailer was searched, no evidence tied him to the girl. Without DNA, without an eyewitness placing her in his company, detectives were left with a man whose record made him suspicious, but whose trail led nowhere. The second person of interest lived just beyond the fields. A farmer known in town for keeping to himself, he had been seen loitering near the barns in the late afternoon. Witnesses described him as odd, a man who spoke little and seemed out of place at a crowded fair. When deputies arrived at his property, they found a life of isolation. His farmhouse was cluttered, his barns filled with tools and old machinery, and his demeanor was cold under questioning. He claimed he had been tending to his animals during the time of the disappearance, and a neighbor vaguely confirmed seeing him in the distance. Still, detectives wondered if that sighting could have been before or after the girl went missing. A thorough search of his home turned up nothing but the artifacts of rural living. No clothing fibers, no signs of a child ever being there. He remained on their list, but the evidence simply wasn't there to move forward. The third lead cut closer to home, and it was the most painful for the family. The girl's estranged uncle had been spotted at the fairgrounds, despite claiming he wouldn't attend that year. His relationship with the family was strained, marred by financial disputes and arguments that had left him unwelcome at gatherings. Detectives uncovered that he had a history of alcohol abuse and volatility. More troubling, his own ex-wife told investigators he had once lashed out when a child annoyed him, raising questions about his temperament. When brought in, the uncle seemed almost offended by the suspicion, pointing out that he had no car that day and had come only to watch the tractor pull. His alibi rested on the word of acquaintances who placed him on the opposite side of the fair at the critical hour. He swore he had not gone near the barns, though inconsistencies in his story kept detectives circling back to him. Still, searches of his home and vehicle yielded nothing. With each suspect, the same pattern repeated, enough to raise suspicion, not enough to prove guilt. Days turned into weeks and the pressure mounted. Reporters swarmed the small town, their vans lined along rural roads, cameras flashing at every development. National networks descended, turning the case into a media spectacle. Anchors described it as a chilling reminder of how quickly a child could vanish in plain sight. For the family, the constant coverage was both a lifeline and a wound. Every mention of their daughter kept her in the public eye, but every rehashed theory and speculative headline reminded them of how little was actually known. The investigation ballooned, hundreds of tips flooding in. Some callers swore they saw a man forcing a girl into a truck miles away. Others believed they recognized her face in neighboring counties. Detectives chased each lead, often driving hours only to discover a case of mistaken identity. The exhaustion was palpable. Volunteers dwindled, search lines grew smaller, and the fairgrounds eventually reopened, though no one attended without unease. The barn where the shoes had been found remained locked, police tape fluttering long after the crowds had left. By the third month, cracks showed. Detectives admitted privately that momentum was slipping. No physical evidence tied any of the suspects to the girl. No surveillance footage had captured a vehicle leaving with her. The carnival moved on to its next stop, workers scattering across states. The farmer remained a recluse, never charged. The uncle drifted back into silence, the cloud of suspicion hanging over him but never proven. Each theory dissolved, leaving behind only frustration and grief. The parents lived in torment. They replayed the day again and again, convinced there had to be something they missed. Every smile she gave, every step she took through those barns haunted them. The mother clung to the shoes found by the entrance, unable to shake the thought that her daughter had been right there, calling for her while she searched just steps away. The father grew restless, driving the back roads at night, headlights sweeping over empty fields as if the answer might appear at the edge of the corn. Their home filled with flyers, missing posters, and police reports, but not with her. By winter, the case had stalled. The sheriff's office announced fewer updates, the media trucks moved on, and the town tried to return to its rhythm. But the family couldn't. Their daughter's room remained untouched, her belongings frozen in time, as though she might walk back in at any moment. The silence of their home was unbearable, a constant reminder of what had been taken. For the parents, it was no longer just about finding her, it was about living with the void of not knowing. And yet, beneath the weight of unanswered questions, one thought continued to surface. If none of the suspects had truly been involved, if no evidence tied them to the barns or the road, then someone else had managed to slip away unnoticed, someone who had blended into the crowd, who knew how to vanish without leaving a trace. That shadow remained, growing darker with each passing day, until the case began to feel less like an investigation and more like a story frozen in place, with its most important chapter still missing. 9 years passed, but time did little to soften what had happened. Each summer, when the fair returned, it carried with it not just rides and lights, but a weight the town couldn't shake. What was once an event of carefree joy had turned into a reminder of absence. Families still attended, but with a new edge of caution. Parents clutched their children's wrists as they walked past the barns, their eyes scanning every corner as though the danger might reappear without warning. The livestock stalls still stood, weathered but unchanged, and many whispered that the child's spirit lingered there, trapped in the place where she had last been seen. Rumors filled the silence left by the unanswered case. Teenagers dared one another to walk alone through the barns at night, claiming they heard faint cries or saw a small figure vanish around a corner. Some swore they saw her near the Ferris wheel, standing in line as though nothing had happened, only to disappear into the crowd when approached. Rational voices dismissed these stories as nervous imaginations, but the tales spread anyway. In a town that had never found closure, superstition filled the gap where facts had failed. For the family, there was no escape. They stayed in the same small house, surrounded by reminders of the daughter they lost. Her room remained untouched, her belongings preserved exactly as they had been the summer she vanished. Every August, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her parents held a vigil at the fairgrounds. They lit candles near the barns and prayed she might somehow return, or that someone would finally break their silence. The vigils became part of the fair itself, a somber counterpoint to the laughter and lights, and the image of grieving parents standing by police tape turned into a ritual the town quietly braced for each year. Detectives came and went with time, the case passing from one investigator to another as retirements and reassignments pulled people away. Each new detective promised to review the files, to chase down any overlooked clue. For a few months, hope would stir, but inevitably the effort would stall. Without physical evidence, without a witness willing to step forward, there was little that could be done. The official language was always the same. The case remained open but inactive. For the family, it meant only one thing: silence. The town itself changed under the weight of the unsolved mystery. Parents who had once let children run freely at the fair no longer did so. Curfews tightened. Families avoided leaving kids unattended, not just at the fairgrounds, but in daily life. A generation of children grew up in the shadow of a disappearance, reminded by their parents that danger could strike even in the most familiar places. The barns, once a showcase of prize-winning livestock, became a place of unease. The smell of hay and animals no longer meant innocence but fear. Exhibitors still gathered there, brushing cattle and showing sheep, but their conversations were quieter, their eyes often drawn to the stall where the shoes had been found years before. Reporters returned every so often, usually around anniversaries, chasing the story that had once dominated headlines. They interviewed parents, asked about new theories, and filmed fresh shots of the barns. Each time, the family endured the same cycle of hope and despair, hope that renewed attention might spark a breakthrough, and despair when the cameras left, and nothing changed. They collected clippings, saving each article in binders, as if holding on to the coverage might keep the case alive. Their home was filled with those binders, missing posters, and stacks of notes. To them, it was not history. It was an open wound that never closed. Children who had been at the fair that night grew into teenagers, then adults. Many remembered the chaos, the sound of her name shouted into the night, the blinding searchlights sweeping across cornfields. Some admitted they still had nightmares, convinced they had missed something important, that they should have noticed the wrong face or the wrong movement. The case became part of their identity, a story that lingered whenever they met outsiders. This was the town where a little girl had vanished and was never found. As the years dragged on, suspicion never fully left the community. Neighbors eyed one another differently. Old grudges deepened under the weight of rumor. People whispered that the carnival worker might still be out there, or that the farmer knew more than he ever admitted. Others suggested it had to be someone local, someone who knew the barns well enough to act without being seen. But without proof, The whispers remained only that, whispers. The fair itself suffered. Attendance dropped, especially in the early years after the disappearance. Organizers tried to restore a sense of safety with security cameras, stricter rules, and increased patrols, but none of it erased the unease. Families brought their children but stayed close, never letting them out of sight. Vendors noticed fewer smiles, exhibitors felt the atmosphere shift, and the midway lights seemed dimmer, despite shining just as brightly as before. The fairground had become haunted, not by ghosts but by memory. Yet the family never left town, despite the weight of those memories. Moving away would have felt like abandonment, like closing the door on their daughter's return. Instead, they endured the sideways glances, the awkward silences, the neighbors who didn't know what to say. They waited. They searched. They kept her face in the newspapers and her story alive on anniversaries, long after the world seemed ready to forget. Their persistence turned into a kind of defiance, a refusal to let the case fade into obscurity. By the 9th year, the fair had returned to something resembling normalcy on the surface. Rides spun, livestock was paraded, prizes were awarded. But underneath it all, the scar remained. The case had not been solved. The truth had not been found. And as another summer approached, no one realized that the fairgrounds themselves still held a secret, hidden behind wood and nails, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The 9th summer since her disappearance began like all the others. The fairgrounds were swept clean, vendors rolled in their booths, and the barns were once again prepared to hold livestock. For most, the preparations had become routine, but behind the surface, the memory of the vanished child lingered. It was part of the place, inseparable from its history. That year, organizers finally approved long overdue repairs to the livestock barn, a building that had weathered nearly a decade of use. Boards had warped, nails had rusted, and the structure needed shoring before another season could begin. For the workers, it was just maintenance. For the family, it was still sacred ground, the last place their daughter had been seen alive. The handyman assigned to the job was a local, familiar with the barn since childhood. He had no connection to the case beyond the unease shared by everyone who remembered that night. On a muggy morning, he moved stall by stall, pulling apart decayed planks, replacing old panels, and sealing gaps. It was tedious, routine work. But when he came to one particular stall, the same section of the barn once sealed off in the hours after the girl vanished, he noticed something unusual. A corner panel, darker than the rest, seemed to give under the pressure of his pry bar. Behind it, the wood looked untouched by sunlight, preserved. And etched faintly into that wood, almost hidden beneath years of grime, was a name. The letters were uneven, scratched deep with desperation, but still clear enough to read. It was the missing girl's name. Beneath it were jagged lines, marks that looked less like words and more like the frantic clawing of small fingers against unyielding wood. The handyman froze, staring at the discovery, the realization crashing over him. It was not just vandalism, not just idle graffiti. It was a message left behind, a final act by a child who had been trapped inside that stall. Within hours, deputies arrived, cordoning off the barn and shutting down preparations. The site was no longer just a building. It was a crime scene. Forensic teams entered with cameras and evidence kits, their presence startling against the familiar smells of hay and sawdust. They photographed the etching, measured the scratches, and cut away sections of the panel for analysis. The girl's name, carved by her own hand, was undeniable. After nearly a decade of silence, she had spoken again through the wood. The discovery rippled through the town. Word spread quickly, reigniting the case that had haunted them for so long. The parents were told, and with trembling hands, they were shown photographs of the etching. For the mother, it was both proof of her daughter's last moments and a confirmation of the fear she had carried all these years. She had been inside the barn, hidden in plain sight, while the search raged outside. The scratches below her name suggested she had fought, struggled, tried to escape. It was every parent's nightmare captured in splintered wood. Investigators began piecing together what this meant. The The stall had been sealed shut that night, its closure dismissed as a safety precaution after an animal supposedly got loose. Workers had been told it was off limits. Now, it appeared that was no accident. Someone had used that stall as a temporary prison, hiding the girl in the chaos of the fair. The thought was chilling. While hundreds searched the fields, she had been mere yards away, leaving behind the only message she could manage. Forensics recovered more than just the etching. Along the lower panel, they found remnants of adhesive, small patches of duct tape residue preserved beneath varnish. A faint fabric fiber clung to the wood, later identified as belonging to a child's clothing from that era. Even a partial fingerprint, smudged and tiny, was lifted, a print later confirmed to match the missing girl. It was as if the barn had held onto her story all these years, waiting for the right moment to give it up. Detectives who had once filed the case away were brought back in, faces lined with age and regret. They walked the barn, retracing steps, realizing how close they had been. They had searched those very stalls, shouted her name in that very building, but never thought to look behind the panels. The frustration was sharp. They had been searching for her far and wide, when in reality, she had been right there, scratching her name into wood. The community was shaken all over again. For years, many had believed she had been taken off the grounds immediately, whisked away in a vehicle. The new evidence suggested something far more disturbing. She had been held there, hidden long enough to leave a message. The implications were staggering. Whoever took her had knowledge of the barns, confidence to act in the heart of the fair, and access to spaces no one else thought to question. The parents attended the vigil that year with the new knowledge heavy in their hearts. Instead of praying for a return, they now stood before the barn, knowing it had been her last cry for help. Neighbors wept openly, staring at the boards that had concealed her. Rumors returned, sharper than ever. Who could have known the barn so well? Who had the authority to close off a stall without question? Detectives knew the answers would not come easily. Years had passed, suspects had slipped away, and evidence had been lost to time. But the barn's secret changed everything. It proved she had not left the fairgrounds willingly. It proved she had been alive inside that stall long enough to leave behind her name, and most of all, it proved that someone within reach of the barns had orchestrated it. The investigation, once thought dormant, was now alive again. And as the sheriff stood outside the cordoned-off barn, he admitted quietly to reporters what the entire county now feared. The truth had been buried not in the fields or the forests, but within the walls of the fair itself. The barn was no longer just a relic of the fair. It was now a crime scene, frozen in time. Forensic investigators worked slowly, careful not to disturb what little remained after nearly a decade. They combed through the stall panel where her name had been carved, documenting every scratch, every trace hidden beneath layers of dust and varnish. What they found only deepened the horror. Along the edges of the wood, they lifted the faint sticky residue of duct tape. Its chemical composition was consistent with brands sold in the early 2000s. Pressed against the grain of the panel were tiny fibers, pale in color, the type often found in children's clothing. Most chilling of all was the faint partial fingerprint, small, distorted, but clear enough to run. When compared against items preserved from her home, the match was undeniable. The fingerprint belonged to the missing girl. It was the first hard physical evidence of her presence inside the stall. Detectives gathered in silence, staring at the evidence bags laid out on the table. For years they had believed she had been taken off the fairgrounds within minutes of vanishing. The search dogs had lost her scent at the gravel road, reinforcing the theory of a vehicle. But the evidence told a different story, one that suggested she had been concealed on the fairgrounds long enough to carve her name and leave behind physical traces. The realization was devastating. While searchlights swept the cornfields and volunteers combed the ditches, she had been right there, a few yards away, hidden behind wooden boards. As the findings were cataloged, investigators dug into old witness statements, searching for details that had seemed insignificant at the time. Several people remembered the barns being briefly closed off that night. Officials had announced an animal had gotten loose, a safety precaution, they said, nothing more. Attendees recalled deputies shooing them toward the midway while barn staff moved quickly to lock the doors. At the time, no one questioned it. Escaped animals were common at fairs. But now, with the stall's secret revealed, the memory took on a darker weight. What if the closure had not been about animals at all? What if it had been a cover, giving someone time to move the girl unseen? Detectives interviewed long-retired fair staff and volunteers who had been there that night. A few admitted the closure had struck them as strange, but they had trusted the explanation. Others recalled hearing faint noises from inside the barn, crying perhaps, though it had been dismissed as livestock. The more accounts they gathered, the clearer the picture became. Someone had manipulated the chaos of the fair to create privacy in that stall. The parents, when told of the findings, broke down. For 9 years they had lived with the torment of imagining her ripped away in a vehicle, taken somewhere far beyond their reach. Now they were confronted with a reality even harder to bear, that she had been trapped inside the very place they had searched, close enough to hear their voices, but silenced and hidden. The mother replayed the night in her mind, recalling how she had called her daughter's name inside those barns. She couldn't escape the thought that her child might have been only feet away, unable to answer. Detectives pieced together a grim sequence. On the night of the disappearance, while the fair was at its busiest, the girl had been lured into the livestock barn. She was taken into the stall, restrained and silenced. Someone with knowledge of the barns and authority over them arranged for a brief closure, using the pretext of an escaped animal to clear the space. While hundreds of people searched outside, she remained inside, scratching her name into the wood in desperation. When the moment was right, she was moved, perhaps hours later, once the immediate search shifted outward. The barn had not just been a hiding place, it had been the first stage in something calculated. The question became clear. Who had the access, confidence, and authority to carry out such a plan? Not a random carnival worker passing through, nor a stranger unfamiliar with the grounds. This had to be someone embedded within the structure of the fair itself, someone who knew the barns, who could order a closure without raising suspicion, who could move freely among livestock and handlers. The circle of suspicion, once wide, began to narrow. The town reacted with fresh outrage. Parents demanded to know why the barns hadn't been sealed and searched more thoroughly on that night. Reporters returned, this time with sharper questions. How had deputies missed a fingerprint? How had no one noticed the name carved into the wood? Officials admitted quietly that the varnish and repairs in subsequent years may have preserved the evidence, hiding it from earlier searches. But the damage was done. Trust in the investigation collapsed all over again. For detectives, the discovery was both a breakthrough and a torment. They finally had evidence proving the girl's presence, but they were left with an even more terrifying mystery. She had never been taken far, at least not in the beginning. She had been hidden in plain sight, close enough to touch, and then moved without anyone realizing it. It raised questions not just about who took her, but about how deeply the fair itself had been used against her. By the end of that summer, the barn was permanently closed to the public, declared off-limits until the investigation reached its conclusion. Its dark interior became a place no one wanted to enter, yet everyone whispered about. Children who had once shown their sheep there avoided even walking past it. For the parents, it became unbearable proof of the nightmare they had feared, that their daughter's final hours had unfolded inside a stall that was supposed to represent innocence and tradition. And as detectives stared at the claw-like scratches beneath her name, they realized the barn had not just held evidence. It had held her voice, preserved in wood for nearly a decade, a voice that told them, unmistakably, that she had been there. And if she had been there, then the person responsible had walked those same barns, undetected, under the cover of chaos. With the barn's secret uncovered, detectives began re-examining the question of access. Whoever had used that stall had done so with confidence, enough to shut down an entire building and keep people out without raising alarms. That kind of authority wasn't random. It belonged to a narrow circle of individuals tied directly to the barns: 4-H leaders, livestock handlers, and the longtime barn manager who had overseen the facility for decades. The barn manager, in particular, stood out. He had been a fixture of the fair for as long as anyone could remember, a man who carried keys to every lock, who knew every corner, and who prided himself on keeping the barns running smoothly. Parents trusted him, exhibitors respected him, and officials leaned on him to handle problems quickly. On paper, his reputation was spotless. He was the kind of man who blended into the background of the fair, always present, never questioned. But as investigators dug deeper, fragments of unease began to emerge. They found old complaints from former 4-H students and their parents, stories about the manager disciplining children in ways that now sounded unsettling. One recalled being locked inside a stall after failing to clean properly, left alone in the dark until she cried. Another remembered him threatening to bar kids from showing their animals if they disobeyed. At the time, these actions had been brushed off as strict rural discipline, the kind of toughness expected in farm communities. No one saw them as criminal. But in light of the discovery inside the stall, the stories felt different. They suggested a man comfortable with control, with confinement, with using the barns in ways others never would. Investigators pressed further, requesting maintenance and access records from past fairs. They discovered something chilling. For years, the barn manager had insisted on overseeing one particular section, the same row that held the stall where the girl's name had been carved. When minor repairs were needed, he signed off personally. When volunteers were assigned, he redirected them to other areas. On paper, these choices looked like ordinary oversight, but lined up in sequence, they revealed a pattern. He had demanded control over that space long before the disappearance, and he continued to maintain that control for years after. Witness interviews added more troubling detail. Teenagers who had grown up in the program described moments they hadn't thought much about at the time, being cornered in aisles, spoken to in tones that made them uncomfortable, watched more closely than seemed appropriate. One remembered the barn manager locking the doors during evening chores, insisting it was for security, leaving them uneasy but unable to challenge his authority. To adults, he was simply a man doing his job. To kids, he was intimidating, someone you didn't want to cross. Detectives also learned that on the night of the disappearance, he was the one who had announced the temporary closure of the barns. His explanation had been the supposed escape of an animal, a claim no one had questioned at the time. But when pressed years later, none of the livestock exhibitors recalled any missing animals. No goats, no calves, no sheep had been reported loose that evening. The story seemed to exist only in his words, never confirmed by anyone else. The parents of the missing girl were devastated by these revelations. For 9 years, they had lived with the idea of a stranger sweeping their child away in a vehicle. Now, they were told it may have been someone trusted by the community, someone they themselves had passed by countless times. The father admitted he remembered seeing the barn manager near the entrance that day, but had thought nothing of it. The mother recalled him telling her the barn was closed when she frantically searched that night. At the time, she had believed him. Now, those memories felt like betrayal. Detectives pored over the barn manager's past, but his ONME record was clean. No arrests, no criminal charges, nothing that would have justified suspicion before. He was known as reliable, dependable, the kind of man who could be called at midnight to fix a broken gate. That reputation had shielded him for decades. Yet the stories, the records, and the forensic evidence converged in a way investigators could no longer ignore. The stall had been used, the barn had been closed, and the man with the authority to do both was the one who had maintained control over that space for years. The community struggled with the implications. Many had trusted him with their children, their animals, their livelihoods. He had been at every fair, walking the aisles, smiling, giving orders. The idea that he could be involved shattered the fragile trust that had survived the case. Parents questioned their own memories, wondering if they had missed warning signs. Former students came forward, some angry, some ashamed, all carrying fragments of experiences that now felt sinister. Still, investigators faced the same wall they had hit before. Without direct evidence linking him to the disappearance beyond circumstantial patterns, there was no way to arrest him. The duct tape residue, the fingerprint, the fibers proved the girl had been there, but they didn't prove who had put her there. The barn manager denied any involvement, insisting the closure had been a precaution, that any claims about discipline were exaggerations. He presented himself as cooperative, even wounded by the accusations. For the moment, he remained free. But for detectives, the focus had shifted permanently. The search for a shadowy stranger had ended. The suspicion now centered squarely within the barns themselves, on the man who had controlled them for years. They began retracing his every step, reviewing his movements that night, and quietly questioning whether the person they had trusted to safeguard the livestock had, in fact, orchestrated one of the most disturbing crimes the county had ever seen. And as they did, the families of the town realized something more terrifying than a stranger slipping through their fairgrounds. If the evidence pointed where it seemed to, then the predator they had feared all along wasn't an outsider at all. He had been among them, year after year, walking the same barns where their children laughed, hidden in plain sight. As investigators focused more intently on the barn manager, something unexpected began to happen. People who had been silent for nearly a decade started to come forward. They were no longer the children they had once been. Many were now in their late teens or early 20s, out of school, with enough distance to speak about memories that had haunted them for years. What they revealed painted a picture far darker than anyone had realized. Several former 4-H students recalled uncomfortable encounters in the barns. They described being followed down aisles, the sound of footsteps behind them, when they thought they were alone. Some remembered being cornered as he demanded they redo chores late at night, his body blocking the only exit. Others confessed that he had touched them under the guise of correcting posture, adjusting hands, or moving them into position. At the time, they told themselves it was nothing, or that adults wouldn't believe them if they spoke. But now, with the discovery of the stall and the reopening of the case, those experiences took on chilling new meaning. One young woman, now 19, described a night she would never forget. On the evening of the disappearance, she had been cleaning equipment in the far aisle when she heard muffled sounds, like crying, coming from behind a locked stall door. She froze, her first instinct to knock, but the barn manager appeared suddenly, telling her the stalls were off limits and ordering her to leave. Fearful of challenging him, she obeyed, but the memory of that sound had never left her. For years, she had convinced herself it was only an animal. Now, she wasn't so sure. Her testimony shook detectives. If true, it meant the missing girl had been alive, trapped inside, while volunteers worked only a few steps away. It also suggested the barn manager had intervened to stop anyone from discovering her. The realization reframed the case entirely. This wasn't the work of a fleeting predator snatching an opportunity. It looked like calculated predation, orchestrated by someone who had planned for control, secrecy, and concealment. Other accounts reinforced the growing suspicion. A boy who had once been part of the livestock program remembered being locked inside a stall as punishment for failing to feed animals on time. He described the fear of pounding on the wood and shouting for release, only to be ignored until the manager decided to return. Another recalled being told not to report bruises left after being grabbed by the arm, warned that complaining would cost him his place in the fair. None of these incidents were ever recorded officially, dismissed as exaggerations or discipline at the time. Now they were chilling evidence of a long pattern of behavior. The parents of the missing girl were crushed by these stories. For years they had lived with the image of a stranger stealing her away, but now they were forced to imagine something worse, that their daughter had been targeted by someone embedded in the very system they trusted. The mother, her voice breaking, admitted she had always felt uneasy when the barn manager dismissed her during the frantic search that night. She had buried the suspicion for lack of proof. Now, every memory of his face carried the weight of betrayal. Detectives compiled the testimonies, cross-referencing them with old fare schedules and staffing records. Patterns emerged. The barn manager had repeatedly placed himself in control of children during times when supervision was thin. He had locked doors, ordered closures, and isolated individuals. The reports described him as watchful, always hovering, always inserting himself into situations. The sheer number of similar accounts painted a clear picture. This was not coincidence. This was a pattern of predation stretching back years. Yet, despite the powerful testimonies, the same obstacle remained: evidence. Memories, no matter how compelling, were difficult to use in court nearly a decade after the fact. Physical traces had degraded, documents had gaps, and the manager continued to deny everything. He portrayed himself as the victim of a smear campaign, a scapegoat for a tragedy the community could not otherwise explain. But privately, detectives were convinced. The case had shifted from the theory of an opportunistic abduction to a deliberate act by someone who had been planning, grooming, and controlling all along. The young woman who had heard the muffled cries became the pivotal witness. Her account of that night provided the closest link between the missing girl and the barn manager. Detectives protected her identity but knew the risk of speaking out. She admitted she had lived in fear of telling anyone, worried she would be ridiculed or blamed for not acting sooner. She carried the guilt of silence for 9 long years, and sharing her story reopened that wound. But she also knew the truth mattered now more than ever. The revelations reignited public anger. Parents who had once trusted the Barnes demanded answers. How had no one seen the signs? How had complaints been ignored? Why had the manager been allowed to maintain unchecked authority for so long? The Fair Board issued careful statements, but the damage was irreversible. What had once been a place of community pride now felt contaminated, the Barnes viewed as the site of betrayal rather than celebration. For the detectives, the testimonies were a roadmap, a way to finally piece together the night of the disappearance. The evidence suggested the girl had been lured into the stall, restrained, and silenced. Witnesses had heard her but been turned away. And through it all, the barn manager had maintained control, using his authority to shield the truth. The case was no longer about a girl who vanished into the dark. It was about a predator who had hidden her in plain sight, exploiting trust and authority to mask his crime. And as the testimonies piled up, one question grew heavier with each passing day. If he had used the barns as his hunting ground, then what else had gone unnoticed over the years? With testimonies piling up, investigators finally secured a search warrant for the barn manager's abandoned farmhouse. The property had been left untouched for years, dust settling over the rooms like a layer of secrecy. Inside, detectives found what they had feared: artifacts that tied directly to the fair and to children who had passed through the barns. In a locked trunk were faded 4-H ribbons, livestock show programs, and small toys no adult would collect. Alongside them lay fairground tokens and photographs spanning decades, snapshots of smiling children with their animals. To the untrained eye, it might look like memorabilia. To investigators, it looked like trophies. The search grew darker when they forced open the cellar door. Beneath the farmhouse, in the stale, airless basement, they discovered signs of something sinister. Rusted restraints bolted into beams, padding nailed crudely to walls, and makeshift soundproofing fashioned from old mattresses. It was a room designed not for comfort but for control. The air was heavy, oppressive, and every detective present knew what it suggested. Though no bones were found, the implication was unavoidable. Children had been held there, silenced from the world above. Forensic teams swabbed every surface, pulling fibers from corners and scraping residue from bolts. Days later, the results came back. Among the samples was a DNA match linking the fibers to those recovered from the barn stall. It was confirmation that the same environment had touched both places, tying the farmhouse directly to the night of the disappearance. The evidence told a story no one wanted to face. After being hidden inside the barn, the girl had almost certainly been moved here, into the cellar of the man everyone trusted. The discovery shattered any remaining illusions in the town. Parents realized the predator hadn't lurked in the shadows of distant highways. He had lived among them, greeting them every summer at the fair. And though her remains were absent, the grim artifacts left behind made one thing certain. The girl had never been far away at all. She had been trapped within reach of everyone, her final cries echoing inside walls that no one thought to question. When investigators finally reconstructed the night, the picture that emerged was devastating. The girl had not been snatched away into the distance as everyone once believed. She had been lured into the livestock barn itself, likely coaxed with promises of helping with animals, something she loved. Once inside the stall, she was restrained and silenced while chaos spread outside. Her parents' voices called her name only feet away, yet she could not answer. The scratches below her carved name told the story of her final fight, claw marks etched into the wood as she tried to escape. The barn's closure, long dismissed as a harmless precaution, now revealed its true purpose. It had been a calculated act, shielding the predator's movements and buying enough time to keep her hidden while searchers flooded the fairgrounds. Hours passed, and when the crowd's attention shifted outward into fields and ditches, she was quietly moved. The evidence from the farmhouse showed where she was taken next, confirming the barn had only been the first stage of her captivity. But it was there, in that stall, that she left behind the only proof of her existence during those final hours. A name carved with desperation, and the scratches of a child who knew she was running out of time. For the community, the revelation was unbearable. They had walked past her, stood near the barn, and searched every corner except the one that mattered. The horror was not just in what had happened to her, but in how close she had been, hidden in plain sight as an entire county looked for her in the dark. Parents replayed that night, wondering if they had heard her, if they had brushed against the walls she was trapped behind. The etching became her last voice, preserved for nearly a decade before it was finally found. The truth left no comfort, only clarity. She had never left the fairgrounds that night. She had been within reach of everyone, silenced by the very person trusted to protect the barns, until she vanished forever into his grasp.